Hey guys, so for my author study presentation, I chose Susan Farr. Okay. Anyways, so my first source was rereading Susan Farr, Rhetoric of Defiance. This is a chapter from a book. So this is the thesis statement from the chapter. Basically, it's saying how stereotyped characters, irony, and personal experiences are the main rhetorical strategies Susan Farr uses in her work to kind of expose the racism towards Chinese immigrants. She uses her fiction and her memoirs and journals, which we didn't discuss much in class, but her journals were very substantial and crucial to her credibility as a writer. But we'll get to that later. So, stereotyped characters in her fiction. Her main argument is the discussion of shared humanness. We've discussed this in class, but it's basically the idea that all humans have the same like fundamental like values as a human, and are fundamentally the same no matter what kind of culture or place that they come from. In this source, Wang uses a specific work of fiction we haven't talked about, but it's called The Story of One White Woman Who Married Chinese. Basically, it's about a white woman. She divorces her white husband because he's mistreating her, and she marries a Chinese man. So this is kind of exaggeration of the stereotype, but it still gets the point across. It shows that the white woman is much happier in her marriage with the Chinese man, and Susan Farr kind of uses this to show that um, the Chinese man is a better alternative as a husband. And it kind of shows the parallel how he could be no better or no worse as a white husband. Um, so here's the two kind of examples of stereotypes we've talked about in class. So Miss Spring Fragrance, being portrayed as unloyal when she travels away from her husband. So this is kind of expressing or exposing Mrs. Spring Fragrance and her husband's relationship. So it's very traditionally Chinese. It was an arranged marriage, and Susan Farr kind of psychs the audience out in making them think that their relationship is unloyal when in reality it's just as flawed and as perfect as any other relationship. So she kind of uses this like very human, flawed relationship to appeal to the reader and show it's really not that much different. And then Laura and Kaisu's love story is definitely more stereotypical American. It's a forbidden love. Um, and the reader kind of roots for these two, even unconsciously, just because they're young. And even in this one, Laura's parents, who are more accustomed to traditional Chinese marriage customs, they adjust their views so that Laura and Kaizu can get married. And Susan Farr kind of uses this as like a way to expose the reader and say that adjusting to one culture isn't really bad and it can benefit the situation. Yeah, so both stories appeal to readers and portray human experiences. All right, so irony. Um, Her main argument here, or Wang's main argument, is that irony exposes illogical human actions, and he uses a work of fiction called The Land of the Free. Basically, this one is about a Chinese boy being separated from his parents when they all immigrate to Angel Island in San Francisco in hopes to um, gain American citizenship. So this one is definitely a very traumatic situation that happened all the time. But Susan Farr's kind of like pushing it in the reader's faces to show that this is an obvious mistreatment and anyone in this kind of situation is being mistreated. So she's exposing their flaws here. Um, and then here's a couple of examples from class that we've talked about that show irony. So in its wavering image, Pan becoming free if she fully Americanizes herself. Um, Obviously she will not be free if she adheres completely to one culture that's not even her native culture. Um, and specifically Mark Carson in this story is saying that she will be free if she completely gets rid of her Chinese heritage, which really isn't the point of Americanization, but it's definitely very exaggerated. So her pressure to adhere to American culture is not constructive. And then in Mrs. Spring Fragrance, we discussed this in class. The quote from Tennyson is complete is always repeated throughout the story. Tennyson is a British author, so Susan Farr's kind of sliding this in there to show that American is already a melting pot. It's inherently a melting pot. Um, so she's using this to kind of hint at the readers that Chinese immigrants bringing their culture in isn't a bad thing. Like, it's simply part of the American experience already. So, personal experiences in her memoir. So Wang's argument here is that she selects specific scenes ultimately to tell her story as a writer, but also to influence the reader in a larger context. And here we're referring to Leaves from the Mental Portfolio of Eurasian. So, um, they both discuss two-way identification and individuality is more important than nationality. So two-way identification, basically, it relates to Susan Farr because her father was English and her mother was Chinese. So she feels this is kind of a concept of her not wanting to adhere to one specific culture. She wants to embrace both. Um, but she kind of realizes in society that that's not really acceptable. And this ties into individuality is more important than nationality. Um, Embracing all of the cultures of yourself is more important than choosing one. And this quote by Wang, I think, really sums up the two-way identification and the multicultural identity that a lot of Chinese American immigrants faced at that time. Okay, and then her journals. So we didn't discuss these in class, but these use her Chinese and English culture to her advantage. Um, she kind of uses this as a way to establish her credibility as a writer. Um, so a journal discussed in this source was a plea for a chairman, a correspondence argument in his favor. That was published in the Montreal Daily Star, and it addresses the mistreatment of Chinese American immigrants in like a fake letter to a chairman. So Susan Farr basically is kind of exposing these racist policies towards Chinese immigrants at that time. Um, in these journals, she also shares that she worked with Chinese immigrants in Montreal, and visited Chinatown in New York. So exposure to these different cultures made her a credible source for discussing the mistreatment and all of these topics about Chinese immigrants. So my second source is the Chinese Exclusion Act in early Asian American literature. This is a more historical based article. So here's the thesis. Basically, it just discusses, or this article discusses historical context and the effect of exclusionary policies on Chinese immigrants and how these influenced Chinese American writers both in Susan Farr's time and even today. So historical context things, these are things we talked about in class, but were also discussed in this article. So the California Gold Rush and Railroad boom obviously brought more Chinese immigrants to America. The Chinese Exclusion Act restricted immigrants and already existing Chinese communities. And then Yellow Peril was just the xenophobic concept that Chinese Americans were hindering American society, or Chinese immigrants were. So Susan Farr's upbringing and inspirations. I just wanted to touch on, or this article touched on more of her upbringing as a child, more of her history as a writer. But I also added a few more historical events in here that I thought were an inspiration to Susan Farr's writing and why she wrote about what she wrote about. So we discussed this a little bit, but she lived on both US coasts. So she lived in New York, California, even in Canada and in Washington for a little bit. Her exposure to these cultures added to her writer credibility. And then Angel Island poetry. So this poetry, or this phrase referred to the poetry that was written on the walls of Angel Island, which is basically the Ellis Island of um, San Francisco or California. Um, and this poetry was written on the walls by um, Chinese immigrants who were hoping to enter the US as a citizen, but were detained awaiting citizenship. So this source kind of discusses this as the first form of Chinese American literature, and I definitely think that Susan Farr used this as a big foundation for why she wrote about what she wrote about, because this poetry specifically addressed like the mistreatment of Chinese immigrants and how they were being targeted. So I definitely think this was an inspiration to her. Another similar thing was the Chinese educational mission in Connecticut. So this mission produced 120 young Chinese American scholars, so they had the equivalent of like college education. Um, and they traveled throughout America and even back to China and used their knowledge to better their country. So I think this was also definitely an inspiration to Susan Farr, considering her cultural duality, having an English father and a Chinese mother, seeing that these educated Chinese immigrants could make an impact in both America and China definitely added to her purpose as a writer and why she wrote about what she wrote about. Okay, connections. These are just some things from both sources that were discussed about and were similar. So her journals introducing her writing skills. Both of the sources emphasized how they paved the way for her. Individuality over nationality. This is an idea discussed in both Yellow Peril and the Chinese Exclusion Act as important historical context. And then how Chinese American literature is still prevalent and that the Chinese American authors, even today, took a lot of inspiration from Susan Farr's work and the work of authors in her time. All right, and here's my works cited. Thanks.